In this presentation, I'll be talking about how you can support your child to revise effectively and prepare for GCSE exams. We'll be talking about some of the key things such as organisation and time management, revision resources, and revision strategies. So before we begin to look at some of those different strategies, I thought we'd start by just talking about why is revision important. This graph shows the curve of forgetting. Now what it shows is how over time our retention of information dwindles. When we first read a text, we might understand and remember most of it, maybe 80 to 100%, but over time we quite quickly forget what we've read. As a result, the purpose of revision is to build a secure long-term memory so that students are able to use this knowledge and apply it to an exam question. Therefore, the real thing that sets effective revision apart is small, repeated efforts over time, so that by the time we come to the final exams, we might have covered one topic 4, 5, or 6 times, so that it's very secure and that knowledge can be used. In supporting students to revise effectively, helping them to organise themselves is really important. Now, not everyone works in the same way, and therefore a revision timetable should be personal and presented in a way that works for them. First of all, you would ask a student to think about how much time they can realistically give per day to their revision, and then of course split that up into their different subjects. This might be in the old-fashioned way with pen and paper, which is quite easy to adjust on a weekly basis. Or there are lots of apps and websites out there now that are both free and easy to use and can be a really good way of keeping track of progress. One of the ones that I would recommend is Adapt, which is pictured, and I think it's a really good way of organising themselves. Once students have put together their revision timetable, it's now time to think about how do we actually structure a revision session itself. Most studies suggest that students don't learn effectively if their study sessions are too long. So we shouldn't be encouraging students to do 1 or 2 hours without a meaningful break, because their minds are going to wander. The Pomodoro technique offers a simple solution. Students are advised to choose a task that is set to last for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. They set themselves a timer and work hard on the task without distraction. When the timer goes off, they have a short break of 3 to 5 minutes, and they repeat this cycle maybe 3 or 4 times. This means that all of the work and all the revision that they're doing is effective, and they're building in that break time as well. It helps students to avoid procrastination and also avoid those distractions. Things like mobile phones should be away, TVs should be off, and where possible, a nice quiet space is best. An important decision in any revision session is of course choosing the right revision resources for students to get their information from. There are lots of different options available to students now, so of course making the right decision is important. The first port of call should always be the class book. Teachers have prepared materials, model answers and so forth, directly related to the exams the students are going to be sitting, and this is going to be the best place for them to revisit their own notes. Beyond this, there are lots of revision guides out there now that can be very effective. Usually they're a bit more broken down than the materials that the students would get in class, so it's a good way of getting a summary of the key topics. There are also, of course, many textbooks that are accompanying each of the GCSE units. These tend to be more detailed, but can also include lots of possible exam questions and things like this. BBC Bitesize is very effective in creating lots of summaries for students to use, and also has lots of helpful videos. Another service that students are encouraged to use is GCSE Pod. This is a subscription service that all students have an access to using their school logins, and it has lots of sort of audio-visual podcasts for students to revise from. There are now as well lots of online materials that students can access for free. Things like Seneca, Educake, Hegarty Maths can be excellent for quizzing and testing their knowledge. Please note though that it's important to ensure that any resources that students are using are specific to the exam board they're studying. So for example, in history, always make sure that the students are studying Edexcel, as different exam boards might have different content and exam questions. Once students have chosen an appropriate revision resource, it's now time to begin revision in earnest and make some revision notes. One of the methods that we've used a lot in school and encourage students to use is the Cornell notes. In order to set up a Cornell notes page, firstly, the students would give the topic a title. This works best if it's an exam style question, as we're thinking in exactly the same way as we're going to have to retrieve that information later. Once we've chosen our question, we then divide the page into two. There should be a column which takes up around a third of the page and a second column that takes up around 2/3. In the smaller column on the left, there'll be key questions that the notes cover. We will then make a summary revision notes in the right-hand column, ensuring that all of the ideas are put into the student's own words. If a student is just copying information from the revision guide onto their notes page, they're very unlikely to remember and retain much of that information, as we can do it without really thinking. Once the students have then made their notes, they can use a highlighter to colour code the key questions and then colour code the part of the text where the answer to the question can be found. Finally, one of the real beauties of this system is that it has a summary section at the bottom. We encourage students to then return to their Cornell notes 1 week later. Without reading their notes, they write a summary of that topic or an answer to the question. They would then reread their notes and see how much had they successfully remembered, what additions and amendments would they now make. So here is an example of how a Cornell notes page might look. At the top there's a very clear title, on the left some key questions from the text, and of course on the right their notes. This student has then returned to the topic at a later date and have made a summary of what they could remember. We've also encouraged students to use revision strategies from the Pixel Revisit Handbook, and copies of these materials can be found in the library. In this activity, what students will be doing is breaking down a big topic into the smaller component parts. At the top, they would write their theme, in this instance cheese, and then break it down into the main ideas, so maybe different types, the production and so forth. So we can see it's a good way of trying to break down information into separate ideas, themes and concepts, and a way of building up those specific supporting details. We also encourage students to organise their thinking into a visual summary. In this particular task, students are required to think about the processes that might be going on in a particular topic. So for example, each box could be part of the process of digestion in science. It might be part of the weather cycle if we're revising for a geography exam, or possibly going through events, a chronology in history, or a narrative in English. to break down the big ideas into smaller steps and stages, and to follow the process through. In a number of subjects, there are also exam questions which require students to organise their thinking by ranking different factors in terms of their importance, and possibly to also justify their decision. On this particular note sheet, it helps students to organise this thinking. On the left-hand side, there'd be a small notes section for each different factor. So, for example, different reasons why the Americans lost the war in Vietnam. Then, for each factor, we'd include in the cloud in the centre any key facts, dates or words that were really important in terms of demonstrating our knowledge. We would then rank on the right hand side the order of their importance, so 1 being the most significant factor, 5 being the least. And of course the why is then encouraging students to justify their ranking and their placement. So far, the revision strategies that we've focused on have been on students relearning past content. This is where they're using a stimulus material to make new revision notes. But it's really important as well that students create quizzable materials. So these are simple, quick revision materials that can be used to check their understanding. A flashcard is a really good example of this. To make a really good flashcard, a set of flashcards, students would first use their book to identify all of the key concepts, facts and key terms that they might need to know. Then, on one side of a flashcard, they would turn that concept or fact into a question. On the reverse of the card, they would then write down the answer with a simple definition. Flashcards should be nice and short and shouldn't have big chunks of text. Once the students have created a full set on a particular topic, they should then use those flashcards to test themselves, saying the answers aloud where possible. Now, sometimes there might be questions that don't seem to stick or they find trickier. Return to your notes and see if you can find the answer, or ask the teacher to clarify. Students can also check their understanding by making simple quizzes on each topic. They might break down a subject into, say, 12 questions and write down the answers as well. If they wanted to test themselves, they can then fold the sheet in half, looking only at the questions, saying aloud the answer, and then checking to see if they got it right. We can also support students by, of course, questioning them and helping them with this. Another quite fun way for students to demonstrate their understanding is through a question pyramid. In this one, students would break down a topic into all of the key questions, but then they'd have to decide which were the questions that were easier and which questions were a little trickier. For the easier questions, they'll be at the bottom of the pyramid and worth 1 point. Going up the pyramid to the most difficult questions, which would be worth 4 points. Students would then return to this in timed conditions and see how many points can they score in say, a couple of minutes answering the questions. They then record their score, and when they revisit it next time, aim to beat it. Thank you for listening. I hope that's been useful for helping you to understand what you can do to support your child in revising effectively. The 3 key takeaways are this. Ensure that students have a revision timetable to help that consistency of revision that's needed for securing long-term understanding. Secondly, support students in choosing the right revision resources for the topic. Finally, making sure that all of the revision notes and revisit strategies are effective so that any time students spent revising is supporting learning and long-term recall.